Excerpt from the autobiography of a yogi. This is Babaji speaking to Lahiri Mahasaya. My son, Babaji said, embracing me, your role in this incarnation must be played on an outward stage. A deep purpose underlay the fact that you did not meet me until this time. You were already a married man with modest business responsibilities. The cries of many bewildered worldly men and women have not fallen unheard on the ears of the great ones. No necessity compels you to leave the world, for inwardly you have already surrendered its every karmic tie. Not of this world, you must yet be in it. Many years still remain during which you must conscientiously fulfill your family, business, civic, and spiritual duties. A sweet new breath of divine hope will penetrate the arid hearts of worldly men. From your balanced life, they will understand that liberation is dependent on inner rather than outer renunciations. So, thank you all again for coming in person. I was just mentioning briefly before we started, I apologize to all those who are watching on Zoom. Just so we can have the right energy in the room, I don't think we'll be doing this class virtually next week. I'll write to all of you who expressed interest to see if you can join in person. And I certainly hope to do this class because it's actually designed to be a 3-part series. However, to do an in-person class, it does take attendance and participation in the class. It defines the energy of the room. So otherwise, I'll certainly be recording the part 3 of also as a video. And as we discussed last week already, we are exploring 3 themes of Lahiri Mahasaya's life, because I was starting to say in the last week of this class, which was the first one, Lahiri, obviously, he's one of the gurus on this lineage, and he represents this tradition of Kriya Yoga. It was through him that we have Kriya Yoga. In fact, the word Kriya Yoga is used generally in many different ways, even in India. And often, even in India, people would refer to Kriya Yoga of Lahiri Mahasaya, because Kriya Yoga, the word Kriya, is not unique or specific to this path. It can be coined in a generic sense also. However, quite outside of the tradition of Kriya and of our particular path, as I was beginning to express last week, Lahiri is almost a revolutionary avatar, because all of the core aspects of his teachings are indicating a certain shift in spiritual understanding. He almost comes as a representative of a very, very age-old tradition. At the same time, the core tenets of everything he was sharing was shifting the entire understanding of spirituality as it was present in the 1800s, which is when he incarnated and he lived in Benares. And the 3 themes that we're exploring, all 3 of them, the first class we explored this idea of outer religion and inner spirituality, of how Lahiri, he was born at a time when religious sectarianism was it was not just a sectarianism, but spirituality was entirely defined by religion and faith. There was no definition of spirituality that existed outside of the religious context, outside of the religious faith that one affiliated themselves with. And Lahiri was this harbinger representing a new way of understanding where one's own spirituality was not tied to either the religion that they were born in or affiliated with. In fact, the way he shared Kriya, as we were discussing last week, just as a brief recap, the way Lahiri shared Kriya, he expected, or rather invited people to follow their faith. It is a little different from how we understand the path of self-realization as brought by Yogananda, because we live in 2023 where religion itself is very loose. It's not something that forms a significant definition of somebody the way it did 100 or 200 years ago. But we are talking about a time where it was such a core definition or identity for a person. And Lahiri, the way he presented Kriya was, we read that quote from the autobiography of Yogi where he said, in order to practice Kriya, he said, Muslims should do namaz 5 times a day. Hindus should do meditation and they should do their prayers, the way they are taught in their faith. And Christians should do their rosary and they should do their contemplative practice as taught by their faith. Almost saying all of those is a prerequisite for somebody to learn Kriya. He was not presenting Kriya or this path as an alternate, but rather a way to transcend that limitation, but also something that requires that the foundation already exists. So he was not negating or defying religion, but rather presenting an idea of spirituality that transcended religious boundaries and making it a completely inner expression. Now, the topic that we are going to explore today is, of course, the next interesting aspect, the three themes, again, to reiterate, because if any of you are watching just this class for the first time, the first one is, of course, this idea of spirituality not connected with religion, the outer form of the religion as not being the central definition of one's spiritual practices. The second one is the idea of renunciation, of how renunciation is no longer about outward form. He himself exemplified that by living the life of a married man, as we saw in that quote. These were Babaji's instruction to Lahiri Mahasaya. Babaji gives him this commission to actually express and define a new form of renunciation. He talks about outer versus inner renunciation. Those are Babaji's words given to Lahiri Mahasaya. And Lahiri Mahasaya's whole life of how he lived as a householder was an example of that, but also defining for the age that we live in, where that outer definition is no longer what characterizes renunciation. Whether one is married, whether one has a job, whether one has children, whether one has responsibilities, is no longer a qualifying criteria for whether they can or cannot lead the life of renunciate. The third one, which we'll talk about next week, is meditation as the ultimate form of worship or the solution for all spiritual quests. So that we will come to. That I'll defer for right now. So all these three tenets of Lahiri's teachings, one might say these three, in a sense, define the teachings of Lahiri Mahasaya. But if you were to step back and think about it, these also are revolutionary because they were not the way spirituality or religion was practiced in 1861 when Babaji initiated Lahiri Mahasaya into Kriya. So all of these were not just an expression that were meant as an example for us on this traditional path, but in a sense, although Lahiri, as we were discussing last week, lived such an understated life, he was shifting planetary consciousness by these three tenets of teaching to usher in an entirely new age of spiritual understanding. Because all these three which seem almost self-evident and important to our spiritual lives today, were so far out of men's imagination when Lahiri actually entered this path. Now, I want to go back and just share a few more details of Lahiri's life. I had my notes here. Give me 1 second. I prepared a whole set of notes which I forgot at home, so I quickly rewrote them here because I keep forgetting. So a few people had asked me about this book and what this book is called. I'm not going to say the name of it because you have to type it in exactly if you are looking for it on Amazon. So maybe you can just look at this, or I put this title also in the video description if you're watching the video later. So this is the book where I'm quoting a lot from, and there are many other books that I've been referring. There's other biographies of other disciples of Lahiri Mahasaya, a lot of stories that I had not read before. I mean, I had read these books before, but until I read these books, I had not heard before because they're very fascinating and they give an insight into Lahiri's life that we otherwise wouldn't have. And also these books, as I was starting to say, many are very fascinated by the 26 diaries of Lahiri Mahasaya. We will talk more about them next week because it is much more connected to the topic that we will discuss next week. Lahiri was the first, as this author proclaims, Lahiri was the first self-realized yogi to document his own spiritual experiences and progress. And this documentation, interestingly, you think, they're called Lahiri's diaries. So because they're diaries he maintained. He wrote notes after his meditations. But by no implication are they just personal diaries that he was maintaining for some sort of personal record. Because the way he was writing them, the way even he expressed all of these things were actually meant for posterity. It's pretty clear that what he was writing was not for himself. It was for the people to come later on. But I was starting to say that as enticing and as mysterious as all of it sounds, when you read the translation of most of it, it's rather esoteric. And, there's almost, I want to say there are more teachings and more to receive from the stories and other things we hear from about Lahiri than to try to understand the subtleties of what he was writing, because they seem a little bit far beyond our experiences in meditation or our understanding of the path. Still, we'll look into some of those next week. In fact, as I was mentioning last week, he wrote, his diaries were written in Bengali script, but he wrote it in Hindi language. And it's unheard of. It's like writing, Arabic and English script or something like that. It was because he was comfortable writing it in Bengali. Bengali script was what he was comfortable writing it in, but he wanted to write them in Hindi because he had the intention to make it accessible to a broader audience. So interestingly, there was a lot that he was doing, and
You wrote it in what language?
Hindi.
Oh,
Yeah, he was actually a linguist. He spoke French and English also. Both Lahiri and Yukteswar were very, very learned. And anyway, we'll come to that in just a bit. But going back to the life of Lahiri Mahasaya, there was another interesting correlation that I noticed as I was drawing the timeline and studying his life a little bit more today. Lahiri married, at the age of 18, he was married to Kashi Muni, who was 9 years old at that time. Lahiri was 18, he was in college. And he married Kashi Muni, who was 9 years old. And I mean, it's common in India. The marriage is not consummated at the time of the wedding. There's actually a whole other tradition that follows later on when the girl is actually ready to go to the groom's house. But marriage is often finalized, or the ceremony is held even when they're children. It's not actually uncommon, as many of you may know. But this is the interesting part. Lahiri met Babaji in 1861 when he was 33 years old. He did not actually have any children until that time. He had 5 children only after he came back. He actually had his first son, Tinkuri. He had 5 children, Lahiri. His children were, the first son was named Tinkuri and the second son was Dukuri. So these two were sort of the carriers of the lineage. Even today, Tinkuri's great-grandson, I'm assuming, is still alive, or his great-great-grandson. That lineage, if you go to Satyalok, which is the Lahiri household, where Lahiri Mahasaya actually lived, that house is not inhabited by anyone in Varanasi right now. But there is another house where his family moved, just about 5 minutes walk from that house, and his family still maintains that other house, and Tinkuri lived there, and Satyacharan and others followed in their footsteps. And then he had 3 daughters, Harimuti, Harikamini, and Harimohini. You don't have to remember all these names. I was just reading all their lives, so it was just fascinating for me to... Yeah, so thank you for bringing me back. So the first child was born only when Lahiri was 36. And this was after he met Babaji. It's interesting that he even decided to have progeny only after he knew himself to be a self-realized avatar. That even his conjugal relationships were present, and he was, bringing these children into the world after he had met Babaji and after he was initiated into Kriya. And, there are a lot of stories even with these 2 children. I'll come to them in just a bit. Kashi Muni herself, she was, we hear a little bit about her from the autobiography of a yogi, who was Lahiri's wife. And the way it is presented is as if she herself was not as spiritually evolved, or not, fairly ignorant when she entered the wedlock with Lahiri Mahasaya. But later on, she's initiated and she's exalted also through association with him. As I was reading that chapter today, I realized most of what we know about Kashi Muni is through her own words. And she's so exceedingly humble that she puts herself down as she expresses who she is and what her role was in Lahiri's life. But as I read more stories from his other biographies, one cannot but wonder that Kashi Muni herself was also an extremely spiritually advanced soul. In fact, the author says that Trilinga Swami, as again, he's mentioned in the autobiography of a yogi, he was very, very well respected. He was just considered a very high Swami at that time, who lived in Benares, and many, many people from all over the country would visit him. And Swamis have to beg for alms. They cannot store food, they cannot cook. There are a lot of rules of the Swami order, because they cannot have any kind of attachment or any thought of future. So they have to always just beg for food and eat whatever they're given. And there was only one person in the entire city of Varanasi from whom Trilinga Swami would accept alms, and that was the father, Harinarayan, of Kashi Muni. His name was Harina. He was Devnarayan. He was the only person from whom Trilinga Swami would accept alms, because he was the only family man in the entire city of Varanasi who Trilinga Swami considered pious. And then he blessed their family, and then Kashi Muni was born. Trilinga Swami actually lived, they say, over 200 years. So he saw many generations. He saw Lahiri's father's generation, and he saw Kashi Muni's father's generation. And of course, he lived during Lahiri's generation also, and perhaps even a little bit after that. He had a very, very long life. So it is just interesting to think about Lahiri Mahasaya living a family life. And speaking of Trilinga Swami, again, I'm sure many of you may remember these parts from the autobiography of a Yogi. There is a very strong sense of hierarchy in India. When you greet and meet somebody in India, especially in those times, perhaps not as much now, but still you can see it today. The way you greet is actually by touching somebody's feet. Unless you meet a vendor in the market or somebody who's a peer or a stranger, you would then just say namaste. But other than that, if you are meeting somebody that you know, you actually always meet them by touching the feet. But it's not like you touch their feet. It's either you touching their feet or they touching your feet. And so there's a sense of hierarchy on who touches whose feet. It's not always driven by age. It is actually driven by the ashrama or the stage of life that you belong to. So the brahmacharis, the grihasthas, and the vanaprasthas and sannyasis, these are the 4 stages of life that are defined in the Hindu faith. And the touching of feet and how you pay respect always goes in terms of the ashram. So in the time of Swami Shankara, going back in time, he was the first one who defied this whole order, saying that this is not sequential. It's based on somebody's spiritual maturity. Again, I won't go into all those stories. It'll be a whole other class series on Swami Shankara. But Swami Shankara, there are a lot of tales and stories from his life where he was the first person to just say, even right when he became brahmachari, he skipped the middle 2 ashram, and at the age of 7, he became a sannyasi, Swami Shankara. And that's a whole different story. And, until the end of his life, he was never accepted for that. None of the religious scholars, nobody would accept him as a sannyasi because he violated the scriptures by not following the conduct of how life is to be lived. So, all that to say, but by Lahiri's time, that was no longer an issue. Somebody could become a sannyasi at any age because Shankara had already set an example. So you always bowed down to whoever was at a higher stage, let's say, not age. That was the first criteria. The stage of life was the first criteria. And if you were in the same stage of life, then age was the factor based on which you bowed to somebody. So all of this context to say, Lahiri was a grihastha, or he was a family man. And he was a family man till the end of his life because he never separated from his wife. So by scriptural injunctions, based on the scripture, the swamis, he has to bow to any swami that he met. But interestingly, Trilinga Swami bowed to Lahiri. A lot of the swamis who lived in Benares at that time, they would actually bow to Lahiri because, in a sense, it was almost this shift in understanding that Lahiri was representing, where that form of outer renunciation was no longer the definition of one's own spiritual maturity. In fact, there's this famous quote from the autobiography of Yogi. I don't think I can get this verbatim, but where Trilinga Swami says, that one seeking which I have given up everything, including my loincloth. Trilinga Swami was a naked Swami. He never wore any clothes. Lahiri has been able to completely be united with that one, while being within the family precincts. And then he goes on to say he is like the kitten in the mouth of Divine Mother. She just puts him where she puts him, and he is fine there. So Trilinga Swami had enormous respect for Lahiri. And if you look back even more historically, that actually is one of the critical factors that determines how the rest of the world sees Lahiri at that time. Because you have to understand that those who were not able to recognize his spiritual stature, for them, he was just an accountant. He was just an accountant who lived in a tiny little home in Benares. And so there was no reason for them to respect him in any other way. In fact, I was reading so many stories from this book. I'm just going to share a lot of random stories here and there because they're just fascinating. One of Lahiri's neighbors, the next door neighbor, really did not like Lahiri. And he thought he was a charlatan. And he was just this family man who was posing to be a spiritual teacher and just doing all sorts of things, drawing people from everywhere. And he would yell obscenities whenever Lahiri would walk out. In fact, he would urinate on Lahiri's house constantly. And when people would protest and say, "Why are you doing this?" he said, "I'm standing in my house. I can do whatever I want." And so finally, Lahiri had to hire somebody to build a wall separating the two homes. And then, this is how the story is told. A lot of the stories in this book are rather strange. Within a week, he falls dead. And within a year, everybody in that family dies and the whole house is abandoned. It's just, you just don't know. Just like the man who gave lime to Trilinga Swami, who drank and he himself was burning. It was not like Lahiri was doing black magic to take his life, but there was some karmic equation that was playing out. But all that to say, one might not be able to tell what Lahiri Mahasaya's stature was just by looking at him, because he was a householder. And householder played a certain role. I want to read a little bit of, I just thought this section was very interesting. I'm just going to read from this book. This describes the physical appearance of Lahiri Mahasaya, and just in terms of how he lived and what he was like. Lahiri normally would not be affected by any illnesses. He was a true possessor of sound health. Sorry, I think I'm in the wrong page. Oh, no, I am. He would attire himself in a dhoti, waistcoat, and a Punjabi. He would wear canvas shoes outside and wooden sandals at home. Those shoes are still preserved at his house in Varanasi. He never took any breakfast. He would take tiffin with a little amount of ghee and sugar later in the morning. For lunch, he would take rice with vegetables. He was a very strict vegetarian. He would drink great quantities of milk. While smoking the hookah every day after dinner, he would amuse his family members. He was 5 feet and 4 inches in height. His arms were long, reaching down to the knees. It's a very interesting description. In fact, one of the names for Lord Rama literally translates into hand reaching up to the knees. And Babaji is often described as hand reaching up to the knees. His hands are often described as being... I'm not going to explain that because I wouldn't be able to. I don't know what that really means, but these masters are said to have hands that are very long, exceptionally. In fact, I'm going to go on a slight tangent before finishing this. When we teach beginning meditation, Master had very specific guidelines for how to sit in meditation. So he always says, put your upturned palm at the juncture of thighs and hips. And it's a hard position to be if you don't have a perfectly aligned back. And we always tell people to just place their hands facing upwards on their thighs and be comfortable when they sit in meditation. And often people ask this question. You see Babaji, he doesn't do that. He sits with his hands like this, at his groin. He doesn't put his hands on the thighs. And this is my own theory. Let me just preface that by saying it. However, if your hands were longer than what we all have, if your hands did extend till your thighs, then this would not be possible for you. You'll have to put your hands till here because they would be too long. So oftentimes this is actually for most people whose hands are normal length, it actually rounds your shoulder bone. It rounds your shoulder blades a little bit. I'm not saying right or wrong, everybody just has to be comfortable in their meditation, but I'm going back to some of how these things are described. So for people of normal arm length, which is what I think Yogananda was teaching meditation too, he recommended this, but clearly Babaji had hands that were much longer, and so he sits differently. The lower position of his body was milk white in complexion. I don't know how to read all of this, but I don't know if it's just a translation that is just saying these things. How can skin be milk white? Sometimes, when things are... No, I'll go on. The lower position of his body is milk white. The middle is rosy. And upper portions of his body is peaches and cream. So... I don't know what to make of that. His presence was so magnetic that those who were acquainted with him would bow down their heads in respect and make room for him to pass when they met him. So anyway, I won't keep going on. I do want to just digress just a little bit because last week I promised that I was going to read. I shared last week about Kabir. and how Kabir, the great saint poet, was actually a previous incarnation of Lahiri Mahasaya. And Kabir was very, very poetic, and he wrote lots and lots of poems. And talking of renunciation, I thought it'll be interesting to read a couple of poems of Kabir, which is basically Lahiri Mahasaya speaking just in a very, very poetic way. So I'll read that and then move on to Lahiri Mahasaya and share some more stories. I'll share two poems. And this is a book that I would recommend. You can find those on Amazon. It's called Songs of Kabir by Rabindranath Tagore. Tagore, as you all know, he was also very drawn to Kabir, and he was devoted to him, and he translated many of Kabir's poems. I'll first read one poem, and then I'll read two poems of Kabir. Again, in this one, this poem is very, very sarcastic. Kabir is actually Kabir also never took any formal vows of renunciation. Kabir never was married, or he never actually affiliated with any faith. He was equally Hindu and Muslim. He is said to have been born in a Muslim family, but he had a Hindu guru, and most of what he preached was about prana and meditation and breath. I mean, the teachings are shockingly identical, especially when you see Lahiri's diaries and Kabir's poems. You can quite easily tell that they're talking about the same thing. And you also wonder if that was the reason Lahiri was writing in Hindi, because Kabir wrote in Hindi too. So I'm going to read one of Kabir's poems on renunciation, where he's almost sarcastic, talking of the renunciate of his age. The spiritual athlete often changes the color of his clothes, but mine remain gray and loveless. He sits inside the shrine room all day, so that God has to go out and praise the rocks. Or he drills holes in his ears. His beard grows enormous and matted. People mistake him often for a goat. And he goes into wilderness, and he strangles his impulses and makes himself neither male or female. He shaves his skull, puts his robe in an orange vat, reads the Bhagavad Gita, and becomes a terrific talker. Kabir says, actually, you're all going in herds to the country of death, bound hand and foot. Anyway, it's a rather interesting poem. I'll read a better one now. Dance, my heart, dance today with joy. The strains of love fill the days and the nights with music, and the world is listening to its melodies. Mad with joy, life and death dance to the rhythm of this music. The hills and the sea and the earth dance. The world of man dances in laughter and tears. Why put on the robe of the monk and live aloof from the world in lonely pride? Behold, my heart dances in the delight of 100 arts, and the Creator is so well pleased. Anyway, so I'm going to now read a few quotes of Lahiri Mahasaya, again on renunciation. There are a few misunderstandings on Lahiri's teachings written by various authors. I don't need to quote here because I don't think you may know what I'm talking about. But Lahiri did, in many occasions, refuse to initiate people in Kriya if they were not married. And and this book that Saranya gave me last week, I mean, there are other examples too, but there is another paragraph here that I'll start with. That is not true. That's what I was starting to say. He did encourage people to marry, especially when younger men came to him. He would not initiate them unless they took on the householder life. Even somebody like Panchanan Bhattacharya, who's almost considered the closest disciple of Lahiri Mahasaya, he is very well known. He would not accept him until he went and married. And there are other examples of that too. So I'll first read this one paragraph from this book.
Do you have some idea of why?
Because, I'll read these quotes, and I think you yourself will have the answer. Saranya was asking me, why did he do that? Lahiri would normally ask his disciples to marry at a proper age and adopt a householder life, as for most people, virtuous married life leads gradually to non-attachment. He was, however, ready to make an exception for those who had an overwhelming desire for adopting the life of a renunciate. Swami Pranabananda Giri was an instance to this point. So, he was just making an exception. There are many exceptions because often they say, but I will read this one example. This time I tried to bookmark all my pages more accurately.
He really rather thought he was
I'm going to repeat it for the sake of the recording. Atmajyoti was asking, so was Lahiri was basically teaching to householders? I think this, yeah, I mean, I'm going to, again, speak from my own understanding of this. It's not, one cannot presume to understand the motivations and the actions of an avatar such as Lahiri. I think he was also meant to bring about a balance. It is not, I want to talk about Swamiji and the Nayaswami order and a little bit of that just in a bit, because renunciation is not as natural. Again, when I read these two other quotes, some of these questions will naturally get answered. I don't think Lahiri was preferring renunciates or non-renunciates or anything. I think he was bringing about a much more natural balance to human life itself. And honestly, if I were to think about it, or what I feel is he was trying to find your shortest way to self-realization. And sometimes that is not through outward renunciation. So, there are a lot of examples of even disciples of Master and other stories where people live certain lives and certain ways in which it might not feel like outwardly they're having a role that is big or special or somehow closer to God, but they may exactly be doing what they need to do in order to tally the remaining accounts for them to be free from all karmic debt. So I'm going to read two more excerpts from this book. Pachkari Bandyopadhyay was a favorite devotee of Lahiri and was quite advanced in sadhana. Because it is extremely difficult to practice sadhana by dwelling in the vicious environment of domestic life, he had developed an apathy towards everything. He had mentally decided to forsake his domestic existence. But for this, the consent of his guru was imperative. Bandyopadhyay Mahasaya one day came to Lahiri and prayed for his consent for him to become a sannyasi. Hearing everything that he said, Lahiri stated in a very grave tone, "Which weighs more, your holy thread or the matted hair?" So the householders wear holy thread. When you become a sannyasi, you tear off your holy thread. That's why you see Lahiri always wears a holy thread. Brahmins wear the holy thread, and Lahiri was a Brahmin. So he's asking his disciple, which weighs more, your holy thread or matted hair? Once you become a renunciate, you don't cut your hair. Do you want to publicize yourself as an ascetic so that people would respect you and you can earn some money? Look, if people could become ascetics by donning the saffron robe, then donkeys and horses could become ascetics. Why should not the asses and horses whose color is more or less saffron be termed as ascetics? Abandon all that madness and remain in the family. Spend your livelihood by earning for yourself and practice sadhana. Never maintain your existence on others' contributions. See, I was going to move on to this point also just in a bit. I'll come back and to talk about some of this also, because earning one's own income is an extremely important part of what is called the householder life. Householder life doesn't just mean that you have a partner. Householder life also means that you're earning your own income, because renunciates don't make income. I mean, I'm talking about the traditional system, but I want to read one other section of this book before coming back to this particular paragraph. Hopefully I remember which one this is. Lahiri desired that everyone should progress in the spiritual path by maintaining a family existence. If anyone expressed their desire to take sannyas, he would refrain them from doing so, send them back to home, and remark, "The life of a sannyasi is austere. If any error is committed by a householder, he can be forgiven. But a sannyasi has no reprieve. The garb of a sannyasi is the external manifestation of spirituality, but non-desirous of self-revelation, the quiet household sadhaka's unostentatious sadhana has no external manifestation." Anyway, so I'll read the whole paragraph. Nevertheless, many of his disciples were anchorites also. So the author is balancing this by saying there were renunciates amongst Lahiri's disciples. He did initiate some disciples into, some renunciate disciples into Kriya. Now, it is also this. Now we go back. We are talking about the 1800s in India. Lahiri, as a householder, does not have the authority to initiate somebody into sannyas. So these people, as they were approaching their guru, it is already a very non-traditional relationship when a sannyasi is a disciple of a householder. It is unheard of. I mean, all of this we are talking about in 2023 in the US, where it may or may not make as much sense as, as these things were important in the 19th century India, but it's unheard of for a householder to be the guru of a sannyasi. And when these disciples were asking him, they were asking him for consent. In the autobiography, you see Yukteswar Giri initiating Yogananda in the Swami order. So Yukteswar Giri, as a Swami in the Giri lineage, has the authority to initiate Yogananda, whereas Lahiri cannot perform that initiation, and he never did. So even these disciples have to find a different Swami who would be willing to initiate them into the Swami order, because Lahiri himself was a householder. So I'm going to finish this quote by Lahiri. I see ignobility in nobility, again, nobility in ignobility. The author, obviously, the language gets a little confusing here. Fortunately, I have entered the true path. This is Lahiri speaking. When I see humanity within a human, and if he wishes to be enlightened, then it is my responsibility to enlighten him. So, I want to go back to this other aspect of being a householder yogi, the income aspect. You know, there are a lot of details this author gives, which I actually find both fascinating and helpful to tune into not just the history and the context, but to the essence of Lahiri Mahasaya himself. Lahiri Mahasaya had 3 daughters, and he had 2 sons. And there were a lot of issues in his family. You know, he had to marry these 3 daughters, and this author gives a lot of descriptions of who each daughter married and where they went and which city he found the groom in and all of those kind of details. And but I'm saying that because in that time, during that time in India, it is a lot of responsibility for a father to get a daughter married. And even after the daughter is married, you have a lot of financial responsibilities. And Lahiri was a very humble accountant living in Benares. His salary was 29 rupees. That's what the book describes. And that was, whether or not it's meager, am I still on? Yes. Yeah. Whether or not it's still meager, it was certainly not enough for Lahiri to run the household. You know, there is a time, especially during the marriage of the second daughter, he has no money to perform the wedding. And Kashi Muni gets really anxious about it, that how are we going to do that? You need to perform this wedding. And Lahiri simply says, it'll be taken care of, don't worry, money will come to us. And then just that day, the Maharaja of Kashi, of Varanasi, he sends gold coins to Lahiri's house without even asking for it. But later on, even after his retirement, I did not know that. I didn't pay attention to it when I was reading last week, but this week when I was taking my notes, he needed income even after his retirement. He had a meager pension, which was not sufficient because he had his children later on in his life, and he had so many more responsibilities, even after he retired at whatever age he did, I don't know. And so he took on more jobs. He started tutoring after that age, and he was the tutor, and he started tutoring because he was so learned in Sanskrit and other languages. He started tutoring the princes and the heirs of the throne of Nepal. The king had moved to Varanasi, and his children were being educated in Varanasi, and Lahiri became the family tutor because the king himself became a Kriyaban and was devoted to Lahiri Mahasaya. So it is interesting to see how even this idea of money place into the life of Lahiri. It is interesting because it is actually very instructive for all of us. Because, you know, at a time in India, maybe even 70, 80 years ago, it was possible to live the life of a renunciate without needing to handle money. Renunciates don't handle money. You know, it's not, you cannot have money, you cannot save money, you cannot ask for money. You can ask for things that you need. Like you always only have 2 outfits. In fact, there's so many rules about renunciation in the Swami order. You know, you cannot have, these are not things that are necessarily followed by everybody, but the Shankaracharya of Kanchi, who Swami met and who I had the fortune of growing up in the presence of, he was sort of the guru of my family when I grew up. He used to follow all these rules of being in the Swami order. And I remember seeing all of this. They were very strict. You have 1 meal a day when the sun is at the top of the horizon, and you always have the 1 meal is one thing. So if there are 4 dishes, you mix it all into 1 ball, and that's your meal. You don't ever indulge your taste. There is no stitches or knots in the clothing you wear. because there's no style, there's no vanity. So you only wrap fabric around your body. You never, here, because I'm saying all of this because it's not something you often see even Swamis doing, because it's extreme. I'm not advocating that it's necessary or important, but I'm just saying how many rules there were during Lahiri's time. And in his time, they were all followed by the Swamis. It's not like anybody would be violating any of these rules. You couldn't tie, you couldn't stitch anything, you couldn't make a knot in your dress. You had to simply wrap it around your body. You had to eat a certain way. You had to stay a certain way. You had to follow a lot of rules. You couldn't sleep in one place for more than 4 days or 5 days. You had to constantly be on the move because your job was to serve the world. You should never identify with anything as your abode, as your home.
So he's not a Swami then?
Who?
Lahiri.
Oh, no, he was not.
And he's a householder.
Yeah.
But still an avatar, so I mean.
I'm stating all of this because it is possible in that time for a Swami to live like that. Whereas today's time, you cannot. You can be a Swami who is really wanting to be traditional in every way possible, but still you need a bank account. You need a driver's license. You need a credit card. You cannot beg for alms on El Camino. You have to go to the grocery store and, you have to pay your rent. So, all of this seems so self-evident right now, and it's the same way in India too. But I'm talking about even in my own lifetimes, I have seen examples of when people didn't need to live like that, even in the 90s. But the world has shifted so much. Now we are speaking in 2023, where it is not possible to live like that, where the world has shifted that the traditional Swami order and all of its rules is not possible to observe in that same way, because there has to be a new definition. And money is, again, an extremely important aspect of it, this idea of a renunciate. And I'm saying all of this because in that other quote that he was telling, where he was sharing with this other disciple who he would refuse to consent for this man to take the vow of renunciation, he says, abandon all madness and remain in the family. Spend your livelihood by earning for yourself. Never maintain your existence on others' contributions. So Lahiri was actually telling him, do not live that life. You were asking, was Lahiri asking people to be a householder? He was not asking people to be anything. But these are important, and I'll go on a slight tangent. Swami, I want to be careful with how I'm saying this because these recordings will go on the internet. Swami was the vice president of Self-Realization Fellowship, as you all know, for about 10 years after Master's passing. And even when Master was alive, Master made him responsible for the monks at the monastery in Mount Washington. So he set up a lot of ways in which that monastery was set up, and it was fairly traditional. Monks did not handle money. Monks did not actually have job roles or gradations in pay. Monks were given a stipend for being a monk, and they were serving in whatever ways they were asked to serve, and it is still the same way. And it is a much more traditional monastic order and it's not any different from some of the Christian orders. So I'm not saying that the Hindu or the Christian orders, the Kali Yuga form of renunciation works a certain way. And when Swami created the monastic orders within Ananda, he made a specific point to make individuals take financial responsibility for themselves. There was no stipend that was given to be part of the monastery. Whoever wanted a job needed to find a job and make an income. So if you found a job that would give you a higher income because you needed that for your lifestyle, that was your choice. If you wanted to work only 20 hours a week and decided to have a frugal life, so you had more time for sadhana or for inner life, that was your choice. But that responsibility he put in the hands of the individuals. And that is an important shift. And Swami himself, I hope I'm not misquoting him, I'm maybe slightly paraphrasing, he actually made it a point, even in one of his books, I can't remember right now, he did that based on his experiences doing this with Self-Realization Fellowship, because he realized what worked and what didn't work. And so when he was doing this with Ananda, he did exactly what Lahiri was asking him to, which is spend your livelihood earning for yourself, never maintain your existence on others' contributions. That renunciation does not mean that you do not actually invest your creative energy in ways of making livelihood. And that is an important part of living a householder life. Householder does not just mean that you have a wife and you raise children, but you're also pursuing whatever resources you need in order to have a fulfilling life that was not distracting in any way, but was also supporting of your spiritual practices. That was an important teaching of Lahiri's life. There are a couple of stories. I was reading the first Kriyaban that Lahiri initiated was a flower vendor in the Dashashwamedh Ghat, where Babaji appeared with Mataji. Then the author talks about all the different people that Lahiri was initiating into Kriya. And at one point, he shares the story of this one man named I think his name was Jaiswal or Jaipal. I can't remember right now. He was a milk vendor, and his milk shop was right opposite to the entrance to Lahiri's house. He just sold milk on the street right across from the entrance to Lahiri's house. And he was a very humble man. He was not educated, and all that he did was just sell milk. And he often would see all these men walking into Lahiri's house, walking out, and just, receiving whatever they were receiving from this master. And he always thought how great this man is, thinking of Lahiri. I mean, how small am I that, I would never be worthy of entering this house or receiving anything from this man. One day, Lahiri walks out and says, I would like to initiate you into Kriya Yoga today. And then, obviously, that was his first interaction with Lahiri. And then he goes on and he initiates him to Kriya. Again, this book is so interesting in that way. And then the author goes on to say, he started practicing Kriya, and he says, his business expanded so much, he became so wealthy, he bought multiple homes in Varanasi. And he also goes on to say, he willed all of that wealth to his sons, and he retired. And he became a very high spiritual soul just by meditating all day. So, it's such an interesting conjunction of what it means to live in the world and not of it. There's another interesting story I'll share. I think this man's name was Hitlal. This man was also a very poor man. And I hope I have the details of the story right. I think so. So he lived somewhere in Bengal. And he was really, really struggling to make income and to feed his family and his wife and to just, to run the household. And he was always struggling. And when his wife and family were a little bit set and things were okay, he had a little bit of money left in his hand. And this man was always drawn to meditation. He would just go sit by the Ganges and he would meditate for long hours whenever he got breaks from his work. And he had this inner call. He had this inner voice that said, you needed to go somewhere. And he didn't know where to go. Excuse me. And so he went to the railway station, the nearest railway station, and he asked the person at the ticket counter, I need to go somewhere. I don't know where I want to go. And this is all the money I have. So this is all I can spend in my travel. And the person looks at the money that he has, and he says, with this money you can go to Varanasi. I can see you're looking for peace of mind. I think you should go there, and you should just pray to Lord Vishwanath and come back. And that would be the best thing for you. So he gives him a one-way ticket to Varanasi, and he sends him on the train to Varanasi. And then this man says, he's in Varanasi, he's a Bengali person. That's not the language spoken in Varanasi. So there's this place called Bengali Tola. That's where Lahiri lived, where all the Bengalis lived. And so somebody tells him, you have to go there because you're a Bengali, because they don't understand his language. He goes there and he meets a man there and he says, I can see you have come from a far distance. Come to my house. You can take some rest. I'll give you some food. And then he goes there. And then the man who actually met him was Lahiri Mahasaya. And then he says, I was the one who called you here to give you Kriya. So anyway, what do we know? But where I was going with all of this is, being a householder had many aspects to it. Even, the conjugal relationship, raising children, that in itself has its own value and place in the society. Even when you read the very first chapter of the autobiography of a yogi, Yogananda describes the relationship between his father and his mother, and how uniting as man and woman once a year was such an important part of their family life, and it was done for the sake of progeny. And the other aspect is livelihood. Whether you make money, what success means. And all of this, I think, it goes back to what we were discussing just 10 minutes ago, which is, It is not so much about householder versus renunciate versus, this form or the other. It was all about what one needed to do in this world in order to learn the lessons that they had left. It was all about balancing the account book of karma. It was all about doing the things. And that's where, again, quoting from that other book, in Lahiri's own words, he felt that the family life was one that was much more suitable to teach non-attachment. And it was something that where non-attachment would develop much more naturally than trying, or going back to that poem by Kabir, where he says, men run into wilderness and they suppress their instincts and they just become like goats. And, they're just going into the doors of death, just like goats, their hands and feet are tied. So, it is all about what would actually make spiritual progress. And with the shift of age, how that actually also starts to influence. There are a lot of other aspects of Lahiri's life that, about being a family. I'll share some more stories about his children. This is actually a very important story. I think I probably cannot find this page because I don't have it marked right now. His daughter, his second daughter, Devi recently shared this story once in one of her talks, I think during Spiritual Renewal Week. Some of you may have heard this. His second daughter had some sort of illness. I don't remember right now. I can't find the page. And, in that time in India, if the daughter-in-law falls sick, she generally returns to the mother's house because, a mother would take better care of her than the mother-in-law. So, she spent a lot of time in Lahiri's household because she was very sick. She was bedridden. And Kashi Muni asked Lahiri, what shall I give her? And this also speaks for women and the motherly instincts and how attached Kashi Muni was to her daughter and her life. Lahiri, we shared some stories last week about the medicines and all of that. And Lahiri had some prescription for her. This is the medicine you should give her. Kashi Muni, interestingly, does not do that. Whatever that was, I don't know. Kashi Muni gets afraid that because she was so close to dying, it almost looks like the daughter was dying. She was afraid that if she gave the daughter Lahiri's medicine and if the daughter died, the in-laws would blame her and Lahiri for not taking care of their daughter-in-law. So she actually consults a doctor and gives the medicine the doctor prescribed, and she ignores Lahiri's counsel on how to treat his own daughter. And the daughter dies, and the daughter does not live. And Lahiri, this was in the evening, and all the disciples are sitting, and Panchananda Bhattacharya, who almost lived with Lahiri at that point, he was sitting in the room and he was teaching the Gita. And the news comes from upstairs, your daughter has left the world. And then Lahiri just hears the news, and then he turns to the disciples and he starts teaching. And then everybody is like, do we need to pause? And he said, no, they're doing what they need to do. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. You do what you're supposed to do, which is listen to the lecture. That's what you came here for. And then Panchananda Bhattacharya, who was very close to Lahiri, speaks up and he says, why not we take a break for today? Why don't we just not continue the class for today and we can resume it later? And Lahiri agrees, more than him probably, they were all disturbed, and he pauses the class. And then later on, the same evening, somebody asks him, do you not feel the pain? Your daughter just left this world. You have to do the rites. It's a very painful thing because the rites of the funeral rites are to be performed by the father when a child dies like that. Do you not feel the pain of having to do that to your own daughter? And Lahiri said, again, I cannot quote it because I don't have the page with me here. He describes it as the consciousness of men who are realized, who know the truth. It's different from the consciousness of worldly men. He says, one consciousness is like the clayey soil and the other is like concrete. Worldly men, their consciousness is like clay. It is so moldable, it's so malleable, it keeps shifting shape based on external influence. Whereas the consciousness of realized men, speaking of himself, it's like concrete, it's like granite. That's what he says, it's like granite. It does not change or shift. And he says, it's like dropping a big rock on your consciousness. And when it's dropped on clayey soil, it immediately makes an imprint and the rock stays there. It never leaves. And he says, when it's dropped on another piece of granite, the impact is felt. However, it cannot do anything to the granite. The rock just bounces off. The pain is felt, but there is no imprint left of the pain. So there is nothing that I carry. I do not carry anything because I don't associate with anything. So, that's something to aspire towards. It's again another important aspect of the householder life, because the other thing that the householder existence comes along with is attachment. Because things are personal and things are impersonal. Some people are personal, some people are impersonal. That taints our understanding, that taints our whole relationship, the world. And Lahiri was so far outside of that, and he was also demonstrating it for how to live a householder, how to be a householder yogi. In fact, with the second son, it's an even more interesting example. It almost speaks for an entirely different aspect of Lahiri, which is how understated and unimposing he was. How he never, ever proclaimed any position, any statement, any stand on anything. Dukuri, his second son, completely lost his mind. He became mentally deranged at one point. And, when people become mentally deranged, they say, you go to Kali temple or something like that because it's considered a darker energy that has taken you over. So they say you have to go to this very remote Kali temple in Bengal. That's what is told to him. Kashi Muni or somebody asks somebody, and they come and tell him that, I think Kashi Muni asks somebody what to do. And they tell her that you have to go to this Kali temple where it's considered very powerful in this remote part of Bengal. And then they talk about how it is so hard to reach, and then he had to book a train, and he had to walk, and he had to go to this temple. And they go to this temple, and they worship, and they do everything there, and they come back, and nothing has changed. He's still the same. And then Kashi Muni realizes, and then she comes to Lahiri and says, why am I seeking the God in temples? I should have come and asked you, what can I do to cure our son? And then he says, just give him this. And then immediately he's cured. So maybe it's the same story as a daughter, but one where she actually takes his counsel, where he was so detached. If she had not, I was reading that story and I was thinking, if she had not asked him for that, it almost sounds like he would have not cured his son. There's a lot of other stories where he just talks about karma and all of that, where he himself does not ever try to make anything happen. Every bit of what happens is sort of the will of the universe. There's a story that speaks to that too, which is quite fascinating. I'll share that as well. The stories in this book are almost so abstruse. Sometimes you don't know what to make of it. There are two stories that the author shares. One, there are two disciples that invite Lahiri. They happen at different stages, I think. But two disciples that invite Lahiri to their house for a feast. And Lahiri never generally takes these invitations or goes, but he agrees to the first disciple. There's one disciple who comes and asks him to go for a feast. And quite shockingly, Lahiri agrees. And then he says, okay, I'll come to your house and have a feast. And then he goes to this man's house. And it's a thing in Bengal where fish is such an important part of that culture that many Brahmins do eat fish, especially as part of religious offerings. But Lahiri himself, as we read a few minutes ago or half an hour ago, he was strict vegetarian. But this man, he did not know that. So he was offering fish, many delicious fish curries that he had made for Lahiri. And Lahiri was enjoying them. Lahiri relishes every bit of the fish curry that is served, and then he comes home. And this other man, invites Lahiri and says, I would like for you to come to my house also to have a feast. I would love to make a big feast for you. And he was a very devout disciple. And Lahiri again agrees, and he goes to his house. And this man at this time, because he saw Lahiri eating fish, and he knows there's no fish that is cooked in his house. He doesn't eat fish in his house. So he probably thinks, he's probably craving for fish. And nobody cooks fish in his house. So he buys the most expensive fish, many kinds of expensive fish, and he makes curries for him. And then he keeps offering that to Lahiri Mahasaya during the meal, and Lahiri Mahasaya gently refuses, no, no, no. And then when he offers the third or the fourth time, Lahiri Mahasaya gets angry and looks at him and says, don't you know I'm vegetarian? Why are you offering fish? And then this man is so confused, and he says, but you ate fish in his house the other day when you went for the feast. And Lahiri looks at him and says, I've never eaten fish. I don't eat fish. I'm a strict vegetarian. And that's the story. And then the author goes on to explain, because, the author himself, obviously, he's a disciple who's so in tune with Lahiri. He goes on to explain that Lahiri was so beyond any identity. Even when Lahiri referred to himself, it was not like Lahiri was absent-minded. It was not like but he was not associated with that body and mind in the way people were. So it was often confusing for people because he was not eating fish. And yet he was. And he was not acting at all. It was God acting through him. And his lack of identity with the action and with everything that was happening through this body was so extreme and so complete that it made no difference to him. And when somebody offered him fish, and if he was identified differently, he would just say, I'm a strict vegetarian. And he would say, I've never eaten fish before. So, it's hard to fathom for us to even think about how in tune somebody must be with a higher reality that they had such little identity left in them. This is not in the same vein, but he would meditate all night. For most of his life, he would meditate all night. He never slept, and when he was done with his meditation, and he would go early morning at 4 or 5 a.m., he would go to take a dip in the Ganges. And he was whenever he did that, he was in a state that was so not of this world. He was in a state of ecstasy when he would finish his practices and he would go to the Ganges. And there was this vendor who would sell beetle leaves. It's a very common thing in Varanasi. It's a thing. Doesn't matter. He was selling these beetle leaves that people chew on. It's not like tobacco. It's not addictive or bad for you, but it's bad for your teeth. Other than that, it's not actually intoxicating in any way. So he used to sell those things, and he would watch Lahiri do this. And he would, for a long time, he thought Lahiri was mad, that Lahiri was just a crazy person. And then he thought Lahiri's probably drunk. And he's like, who's this man who drinks at 4 a.m. in the morning? And he looks like a Brahmin, and he's drunk at 4 a.m. going to the Ganges to take a dip. And slowly he realizes that he's actually not drunk. He keeps watching him every day. This is very, very early on in Lahiri's life. And then he realizes that this is actually a great soul. He's a spiritual teacher. And then he goes to Lahiri, and then he takes Kriya himself. And again, the author says he became a very, very evolved, highly advanced yogi. But from that day on, he says, he would always bring 2 rolls of beetle leaves. The first thing he would do is bring it to Lahiri to his home every morning before he would start selling. Because Lahiri did consume those beetle leaves. He would chew on them. And even after Lahiri's passing, he outlived Lahiri by many, many years. He never stopped. He would just come, place 2 rolls of beetle leaves, and he would he would just be moved to tears before he would go on with his day and sell those beetle leaves. I don't know what his physical movements were. Lahiri was basically not in his body or not grounded because he was just in a state of ecstasy. I don't know what that looked like. Yeah. So Saranya is asking the question, who did Lahiri pray to as God? Actually, I'm going to read a quote which I didn't get a chance to last week because I couldn't find the page. And what I thought was maybe we will do a brief chant because you will see. It's a beautiful quote. There's also another answer to that question which I'll share next week. So because there's another quote which is very beautiful, and I think it'll be very related also to the topic of next week. I think now I actually want to read. I'll read a poem of Kabir first, and then I'll read this particular quote from the book, and then we will do a brief chant. Any other thoughts anybody wants to share on being a householder yogi? Because I'm going to shift topics from there. If anybody has to say anything or wants to share.
I don't know if you want to share any of your experience around that.
My own experience on being a householder yogi, or with Lahiri Mahasaya. Oh, Saranya is asking my own experiences because I had taken a vow of renunciation. I was at some point, and then now I'm a householder yogi myself. I feel too far from being able to speak about this in any way that, let me see how to say this. I'm going to speak very personally because you're asking a personal question. I think, even going back to the 4 stages of life as described in the Hindu scriptures, this is not I mean, things happen a certain way. There's karma, and life unfolds in its own fashion for each person. And, there's planets and stars that determine the trajectory of many things that happen, and your karma with specific people that also determines outcomes. I think, in my own way, both at that time and even when I look back at it right now, that was not sannyas, what I had taken on. In fact, what I had taken on was the brahmachari vows. And in a sense, that was a stage of life. That is a stage of life. In the Indian tradition, it is something that you live between the ages 7 and 11 or 12 or beyond that until you marry. Basically, it is a stage dedicated to learning, self-discipline, of restraining your senses, of being able to practice certain constraints on yourself in order to both hone your willpower, but also to go deeper, not just in spirituality, but even self-mastery, let's just say, let's use that word in a broader sense. And I think in the culture that we are in, there's a lot that is in the book Sadhu Beware that I would also recommend because I know it was part of our book study group last year, and a lot of these discussions came up over and over again because it was a recurring theme where Swami at one point talks about the rite of passage, if you remember those sections in the book, and why he emphasizes on rite of passage. Maybe even more importantly for men, I don't remember, but he does emphasize on that ceremony. So the sacred thread ceremony, in a way, is a rite of passage. Now, in the culture that we all grow up in, it doesn't matter, India, America, no matter where you live in the world, it's all sort of the Western world. I say that because our system of education is Western. You don't go to the Gurukul, you don't live on alms. That's not what you do these days. I don't think most people experience that stage of life of self-restraint, even when they grow up at the age of 7, 8, 9. And that stage is extremely important before engaging in the householder life. It's not the same as sannyas, because one has to actually have an awareness of how their energies flow, what it means to indulge their instincts versus restrain them, the maturity to know the difference between the two, and to actually have enough self-awareness, stages of self-discovery to know how you can work with yourself and who are you. The level of self-awareness that it takes to go deeper on the spiritual path. I think in my own case, and speaking personally, I think it was an essential part of my life, and that's how I see that part of the journey. And I do think that is a very important component that is missing in general in our culture, because kids just grow up unconsciously. When a child discovers sexuality or when the child goes through puberty, the influence of the outer world is so overpowering that there's no space for self-discovery. There's no place for exploring the concept of restraint, or there's no place for exploring there's no place for exploring where does your physical instinct guide you in the right direction and where it can lead you in the wrong direction. The world itself as a whole has lost it in a very significant way. I'm not saying you can't do anything. Even if you were a parent today and you were raising an 11-year-old, you cannot. You're not living in the wilderness. You're going to the public school, and it's just it's fascinating for me. Somebody was telling me that you can be in relationship as early as 10 or 11 years old. In this country, in schools or things like that, that's when it actually starts. I mean, I didn't go to school in that way. India was not that way when I went. I have no idea what it is like right now. So, to answer your question directly, I think the phase of my life as I see it was more valuable in that sense, because I realized also, looking back now more than even at that point, that was an essential part of spiritual growth that I had missed. And having that phase was actually quite useful to experience that in a way before actually embarking on the journey of being a householder. So that is, it helps you have a better perspective and better awareness of yourself before you understand what you're getting into. You're welcome. Okay, now completely, go ahead. Yes, I'm going to read. Maybe I'll read a poem by Actually, I'll just read this I'll read this poem by Kabir next week. This is a very interesting quote, and as I'm reading this, you will know what chant we are going to chant before we end the evening. Prana is the father, mother, son, and the intimate one. Prana originates from prana and again settles in prana. Prana is dharma, that is religion, because everything is held by prana. Prana is action, for without prana, no action can be accomplished. Prana is the living being because prana is vibratory. A living being remains alive. Prana is Shiva, the one who destroys. Prana is Vishnu, the protector. Prana is Durga, for by dwelling in the body fort, it annihilates all adversities. Prana is the primordial energy, since it is the only one to dwell in the body abode. Prana is all-pervasive within and without the body. Prana is omniprescient. Therefore, from man to insects, winged creatures, the animate or inanimate beings, for all, prana is the only worship and religion. All gods and goddesses worship prana. From Muslims, Hindus, Christians, from human beings to all types of creatures, all worship prana without any discrimination. If prana is non-existent in the body, nothing remains. The senses, organs, mind, intellect, pride, etc., all exist upon the existence of prana. Therefore, all should love the universal prana, thereby love towards all living beings will emanate. Prana is the origin of love. Prana is the master of all, therefore prana is the controller of the universe. Thus, love prana. All should nurse prana by practicing the action of prana karma. He says another word for pranayama. It is now that the prana can be attained. You are prana. That prana has confined your present you, and again, it is the prana that will release your present you. It is beyond the power of anyone other than prana to give you salvation. Prana is the master of bondage and also the emancipator. So, we will chant just briefly and then we will meditate for just a few seconds before we finish the evening. Desire, my great enemy, with his soldiers surrounded me, is giving me lots of trouble, oh my Lord, is giving me lots of trouble, oh my Lord. That enemy I will deceive, remaining in the castle of peace, night and day in thy joy, oh my Lord, night and day in thy joy, oh my Lord. What will be my fate, oh Lord, tell me. Pranayam be thy religion, pranayam will give thee salvation. Pranayam is the wishing tree. Pranayam is the wishing tree. Pranayam is beloved God. Pranayam is Creator Lord. Pranayam is the cosmic word. Pranayam is the cosmic word. Control the little pranayam, become all-pervading pranayam. You won't have to fear anything anymore. You won't have to fear anything anymore. Night and day in thy joy, O my Lord. Pranayam is the wishing tree. Pranayam is the wishing tree. Let's take a brief moment of meditation now, feeling the presence of prana in our body, flowing in our spine, animating every cell of the body. And feel that prana originating, being controlled at the spiritual eye. Feel the presence of the prana there, offering your own will and all that you are at the feet of prana, at the spiritual eye. Also visualizing there the presence of Lahiri Mahasaya as our guide. As the Guru guiding us in our quest to understand and work with prana.